Elon has sued OpenAI, begun the meme wars have. After we finished the recording last week, the memes are incredible. After we finished recording last week, Elon sued Sam Altman, Greg Brockman, and the OpenAI organization. He's suing for breach of contract, fiduciary duty, and unfair competition. And his argument is basically OpenAI started as an open source nonprofit. As you know, he gave them something like 50 or 75 million for both those numbers quoted. And then, of course, everybody knows OpenAI turned into closed AI. They became a closed source for-profit venture after the tech was deployed. This enabled them, obviously, to benefit from non-profit tax breaks while building the tech. But they now have two corporate entities. There's this nonprofit called OpenAI. There's a for-profit. It's called OpenAI Global LLC. That was created in 2019. And there's all this funky relationship between the two. We'll get into that because it's kind of interesting, actually. Elon said that if OpenAI is allowed to do this, then it should be the standard for every company going forward. That's an interesting point. You could start by donating money to a nonprofit and then make a for-profit. Seems pretty capital efficient. So what does Elon want to get out of this? According to the lawsuit, he wants OpenAI to open source their models. By the way, that's what Facebook and Apple are doing right now. So that seems more than reasonable since that's how the company was formed. And he wants to make sure that shareholders receive no financial benefit from OpenAI. And we can get more into a bunch of the OpenAI nonprofit status and their structure. It's super convoluted. But I want to just get your initial reaction, Sachs.
I haven't read the legal filings, Jason. My knowledge of the case is just coming from following what's on Twitter. And the last time I commented on one of Elon's lawsuits on this pod, I ended up in 6 hours of deposition. So remember that was the whole Twitter lawsuit. In any event, my understanding of the case from the tweets that are flying back and forth is I think Elon is making 2 points. One is that when OpenAI was set up, it was set up to be a nonprofit and to promote AI as an open source technology that everyone could benefit from, and no one large tech company would control. In that case, Elon was primarily concerned about Google. I think now he's more concerned about Microsoft. Nonetheless, the idea was that this would be open source. So I think point number one is Elon feels like the rug was pulled out from under him after he donated $40-something million to this. They completely changed what it was going to be. And I think he's used the word swindled before. He feels like he was cheated. And I think usually when there's a lawsuit like this, it's usually because somebody does feel fundamentally cheated by what happened. So I think that's the first point. The second is that I think that Elon's making is, well, wait a second. If you can start a company as a nonprofit using pre-tax dollars and then all of a sudden convert to for-profit, then why wouldn't everybody do this in order to circumvent paying taxes? And I think that's another, I'd say, valid and interesting point that he's made. Now, OpenAI has responded to this by publishing some of Elon's emails to them, and they think that they have a smoking gun here because apparently Elon told them they need to raise far more money in order to have a chance of taking on Google/DeepMind. I just don't know whether that's the smoking gun they claim it is, but that's basically what they're putting out there. And then to add fuel to the fire, you've got VCs coming over the top debating different aspects of this. You've got sort of Vinod defending OpenAI. He was the first VC investor in it. And so he's been out there attacking Elon. And then I think Mark Andreessen is responding to Vinod, and maybe I don't know if he's exactly defending Elon. Anyway, it's turned into a whole maelstrom on X, and then everyone else is starting to put out a whole bunch of crazy memes. So I don't know who's going to win this case in court, but the memes are definitely lit. And maybe the funniest one is that Elon has said that if OpenAI will simply change their name to Closed AI, he'll drop the lawsuit.
I think he's serious about that.
I think he is serious about it, but I think he's making his point, which is you ended up doing something different than what you told me when you got me to write this big donation and when we co-founded this thing together. So yeah. I think that sort of sums up Elon's position on this.
Chamath, a year from now, where do you think we'll be with this?
Well, I think there's one more thing, which is that they used his name pretty aggressively to get more money. And he was very instrumental in getting some of the early critical hires particularly Ilya, which has been, I think, well documented, Sutskever to leave Google, right? So that's probably Sachs where also some of this feeling that he was bamboozled comes from. But I think that all of those emotions matter less than the rule of law, which is his second point, which is the important point. Irrespective of whatever one email says or another email, it's not great for the US tax system if all of a sudden a big gaping loophole is identified and taken advantage of. I think that there's a huge economic incentive for the state of California, every other state where these OpenAI employees lived and have gotten equity and now have gotten paid. There's an incentive for Treasury. There's an incentive for the IRS. It touches a lot of aspects of very complicated tax law. And so I think that's why there will be a resolution to this case. Because I think that that answer is very important. And I think it will, as he has correctly identified, motivate a lot of people's actions going forward. So independent of what the emotional situation is amongst all the actors in this play, the reality is he's identified a loophole and that loophole needs to get fixed. I'll give you a different example of this that's much more benign, but it dragged on for 8 or 9 years. At Facebook, there was a period where, and this was public, so I can tell you, we transferred a lot of our IP to Ireland at one moment, and there was a transfer payment and whatnot. And then a few years afterwards, when everybody realized, including us, and we had miscalculated, but when everybody realized the value of Facebook, that transfer payment did not seem correct. And it was a huge tax arb that we had facilitated, right? Because all of that IP sitting inside of Ireland gets taxed at a very different rate than that IP would have gotten taxed in the United States. And other companies had copied this. Long story short, the IRS sued. Similar to you, David, I was in years of depositions and interviews and all of this stuff. So the point is that the government really cares about these kinds of things because so much money is on the line. And if OpenAI turns out to be this multi-$100 billion behemoth, this will get figured out in court because there's just too much money at stake.
Freeberg, any thoughts and maybe Steelman, if you feel like it, OpenAI's position?
Yeah. I think we're all ignoring the documents that OpenAI put out yesterday showing emails and interactions with Elon, where Elon acknowledged and recognized the necessity of having a for-profit subsidiary that could pursue the interests of the foundation by raising billions of dollars of outside capital. I think it's a really interesting set of facts that provides a different light on the story, and it was really important that OpenAI released it. I'm going to share a...
Well, but hold on, Freeberg. I did mention that.
Freeberg, I mentioned that too. My point is it doesn't allow you to break the law.
Yeah, so let me just tell you guys a little bit about another example. My sister works at a nonprofit called the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Cystic fibrosis is an inherited disorder, affects the lungs and digestive tract. It's debilitating, really affects children. There was a nonprofit called the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, established in 1955. They did tons of work on drug development research, and it was a nonprofit for years until they realized that there needed to be a market-based system to create the necessary incentives to drive the capital needed to find a drug that could cure cystic fibrosis. And in the year 2000, they invested out of their foundation endowment $40 million in a company called Aurora Biosciences. Subsequently, it was acquired by Vertex, and they continued to invest another $60 million. So a total of $100 million in the lifetime of the development of a drug that could cure this disease. In 2005, a drug was discovered, and in 2012, the FDA approved it. The nonprofit then sold their rights, their interest in this for-profit entity for $3.3 billion. It was an incredible return. It was the largest investment return by a nonprofit in history.
Who did they sell it to? Back to the company?
I actually think they sold the rights to Royalty Pharma, who you and I know well. And that $3.3 billion opened up this ability for them to continue to make investments. They now fund biotech VCs, and they make direct investments and other things. But it really set the benchmark for this concept of what's called venture philanthropy, where a nonprofit parent company can make investments in for-profits that can raise additional capital that's needed to pursue the broad, difficult interests of the nonprofit. And I think that this argument really kind of ties into what happened with OpenAI. And you can see it in the email exchanges with Elon, where he was so prescient that I give Elon extraordinary credit for this, that he saw that this is going to take billions of dollars a year of investment to realize the pursuit that OpenAI was going after. And there was no way that Elon was going to be able to generate that cash himself, or that Reed or others were going to just be able to pony up that money. They needed to have some sort of for-profit vehicle that would allow the market to work and allow capitalists to find their capital into this organization to make this investment interest. So I think the real question with respect to is OpenAI in trouble as a foundation is, does the nonprofit own a meaningful piece of the for-profit entity? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if you guys do.
Sounds like it. I mean, yeah, it must, right?
So if they do, then they have an investment interest. The second question is, does the nonprofit parent still do charitable stuff? Because if it doesn't, then there's a real question on the nonprofit status. I think you have to have a certain amount of your assets deployed every year in order to qualify for 501c3. So I think the test in the courts will likely end up being, look, it's totally reasonable to have a for-profit entity, to fund a for-profit entity. Other nonprofits have done it, particularly when you need to attract billions of dollars of outside capital to make it work. The real question is, does the nonprofit still do nonprofit stuff?
That's an interesting question, because, Freeberg, do you think that when they booted off the nonprofit experts from the board, that they may have crossed a tripwire there?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm no lawyer. That's a great question. Yeah.
I did a little journalism, and I talked to a couple of people who are in and around two other of these scenarios. One of the key issues here is that the IP, in your example, Freeberg, it wasn't like that cystic fibrosis organization did the drug discovery, right? They didn't do it, correct?
Well, I think they handed over some research that was open and public at the time, and but they funded an independent for-profit.
Right. And so what happened here was you had the IP and the employees of the nonprofit gifted. They were transferred over to the for-profit organization, right. And when the Mozilla Foundation did this, and another company called Samasource, and these both have two structures, a nonprofit and a for-profit. But in both of their cases, they set up separate boards. And the two different boards, answer to the for-profit concerns and the nonprofit concerns. They also didn't give huge chunks of equity to all of the employees, which then sold them in secondary. So what's happened here is all of the IP, in all likelihood, has been, and the wealth transfer has gone to all these employees. They've now done a secondary. And this actually triggers a lot of IRS investigations. The Mozilla Foundation, which was making the Netscape browser, which many of you probably have used over the years, they were making hundreds of millions of dollars a year, David, from advertising with Google. The IRS said, hey, wait a second, you look like a for-profit to us. So they made a for-profit entity. All of the, and Mitchell Baker and the team over there set this up. So all the money went back into the Mozilla Foundation and their nonprofit efforts. And they just paid above market salaries. But it was very important that these things be separated and that the employees not have equity and that all that money flowed back up. And I think this is where OpenAI is going to get super tripped up. And I think the IRS is going to have a field day here.
Here's Nick, can you please throw the image up? This is from the OpenAI website that explains their structure. So let's just speculate for a second because we're just guessing. But it has been reported that Microsoft owns 49%, right? That's the number.
Of the for-profit.
In this example, Microsoft, where it says minority economic interest, that number there would be 49, and that's what they own of this OpenAI Global LLC. And the majority owner is this holding company. Okay, so that means 51% is there. But it says here that 51% is owned by a combination of the nonprofit, employees, and investors. So the question is, back to Sachs's question, we can know very precisely how much the nonprofit owns by just Xing out the investors and employees. And I'm going to guess it's at least 30 or 40%. I think that's probably a pretty reasonable guess. So it means that the OpenAI Foundation probably owns somewhere between 5 to 20%. Is that fairly reasonable guess? At the maximum?
That seems right. Yeah.
And so I think that they're going to have to show that ownership structure and decompose all these entities and show the actual percentages. If it's a lot less than that, if it's say like a 1% thing, then it's a little bit more sketch, I think. But if it's really like 15 or 20%, they're still going to have to prove that all of this was done in a clean way, because the big thing that these guys did was, because by creating this LPGP structure and these capped profits, it's clear that they were trying to avoid something. And the question is, in the discovery, will everybody learn what it is that they were trying to avoid? Because I've been through this. I think, Sachs, you've been through it. Freeberg, you were through it. When you set up these large vehicles and pooled amounts of money, folks come out of the woodwork with all kinds of convoluted structures. And the discipline is always to tell these lawyers and accountants no. And they'll be like, let's set up a master feeder and you'll go through Bermuda and this and that. And it's so easy to say yes because it's very seductive what they're selling you. But it's always about trying to avoid something. So the real question is, why this convoluted structure? What was it trying to avoid?
And where did this IP come from? Like, all that IP, Sachs, came from a nonprofit. All those employees worked for the nonprofit. Then they decided to go from an open source model to closed. And then by doing that, they capture all the value. And then it's gifted to these employees and this investor base. That's where I think
But remember,
something
I think it's
doesn't seem right.
Well, it's important to remember the majority of the IP that exists at OpenAI today was generated after the for-profit was set up. The real question was there a fair transfer at the time when it was set up of value into this for-profit entity? And my guess is that GP box that you just looked at, the compensation that they're earning through that GP box that the nonprofit earns is likely meant to be kind of a fair amount relative to what was contributed at the time. The real question for me still remains, what other nonprofit and charitable work does the OpenAI 501c3 actually do? And if the answer is nothing, and it's just a shell nonprofit, and under it, the only thing that it owns is a for-profit interest, then I think there's a real question on what's the activity. And I don't mean to speak out of turn on all this stuff. I don't know enough, but I think that's the only sort of lens I would kind of look at this stuff through.
Sachs, you were going to say something.
Well, a couple of points. One of my contentions has been never innovate on structure. All you do is create legal problems. There's a tried and true way of creating a startup, which is a C Corp. When you try to innovate on legal instead of product, it almost always backfires. The second point here is I think OpenAI is in a little bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. To go back to Freeberg's point about the nonprofit sitting at the top there, remember what created all the problems when Sam briefly got fired as CEO and then came back is they had these directors from the nonprofit world who didn't really seem to understand how startups worked. And so either they fired Sam for no reason, which was kind of incompetent, or they had a really good reason but didn't communicate it properly, which was also incompetent. Either way, that whole thing was a spectacle. And it just kind of showed that there was this like culture clash going on between the for-profit company and like the standard way of running a Silicon Valley startup to maximize the outcome, and then this nonprofit board that was sitting on top of the whole thing. So I think that now they're in the situation where they've changed that nonprofit board. They've booted off the nonprofit people, and that may have been the right thing for the for-profit entity, but now it might get them in trouble because it lends credence to Elon's lawsuit that they've completely changed the original mission of this organization. Right? It was supposed to be supposed to be open source.
Yes.
And it was supposed to be nonprofit, and now it's for-profit and closed source.
Think about this, and again, we are speculating here, but if the mission was to be open source, and then you realize you've got something super valuable, and you close source it, create a for-profit, and then take all the employees and all the IP and put it into the for-profit, lock it down, break the original mission that, hey, this was going to help humanity because we're going to make it open source. So if you donate money here and we get the tax exemption, humanity benefits because everybody gets to look at that code at the same time and work on it and iterate. Now they've just basically stolen all that in order to enrich themselves. And I think then you add to it Sam maybe doing some deal making, which seems to be one of the triggers according to reports, and this OpenAI venture fund, et cetera. Maybe that deal making made the nonprofit people say, hey, listen, you're doing even more for-profit stuff with the OpenAI name. We're supposed to be a nonprofit here.
What's the venture fund thing?
He started a venture fund to invest in companies called the OpenAI Ventures Fund, and he was the sole owner of it, which they're saying now is a clerical mistake or something. But he's invested in a bunch of startups that have unique access to the OpenAI, I think, infrastructure.
Sorry, he's the GP on behalf of OpenAI.
Yes, the OpenAI.fund. Yes.
But he's a GP on behalf of himself or on behalf of OpenAI?
The way the paperwork was done, it was on behalf of himself. They're now saying that was done in error. So, okay, fine. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Who knows?
Wait.
It's actually, we're going to say something.
Wait. The OpenAI fund.
Yes.
Whose money is that?
Sam raised money to create an OpenAI fund to invest in companies using OpenAI software.
Okay. So that's a different kind of issue. That's called a corporate opportunity issue where OpenAI's fund, it's basically a conflict of interest where the economic opportunity of the OpenAI Startup Fund should belong to OpenAI. If Sam created a separate fund with separate LPs that he's the GP of and gets economics in that, then that's a potential usurpation of a corporate opportunity. I don't know the truth of that matter. I'm just saying that's a slightly different issue. To go back to the point,
it uses the OpenAI name.
Yeah, that's where the corporate opportunity becomes really explicit. To go back to the point you were making a minute ago about the employees, I just think, you use the word stealing. I think that's a really strong word. I think we have to compliment the employees of this company, if it is a company, including Sam, including Greg, including Ilya, for creating an amazing product, right?
Something incredible.
They've created something incredible.
Absolutely.
And they've created, I think, an amazing ecosystem. And there's a lot of developers building on top of this. And I think no one is attacking their work. And I think it's a little too harsh to say that anyone's stealing anything because they have created all the value. The question, and I think you have to include Sam in that and say that he's done a great job, okay, as CEO, because they've built something amazing.
And Sachs, to your point,
right.
It's not stealing because very smart investors are putting in money eyes wide open.
Yeah. I think that the criticism here is related to structure. From my standpoint, it's related to structure and whether Elon was told something at the beginning that's different. It got changed. And clearly it got changed in a way that was not consistent with the terms under which he initially contributed all this money.
Yeah, mine is, I'm stating what is the most cynical interpretation of what happened here. There is the most, benign and benevolent interpretation you could have as well. And maybe the truth is in between the two. But the series of events that occurred does not look good when you have a mission to give this intellectual property to the world. So no one person benefits from it. All of humanity is supposed to benefit from it. That was the point of being open source.
Right.
Then you close it. Now, who gets the benefit if it's closed?
Right.
The employees.
Right. That's a good point.
And that's going to be the crux of this. And if you really want
the investors.
But
that's how they were able to attract billions of dollars because you can't get billions of dollars to invest in something that's going to be open sourced. And
then the employees sell $2 billion in secondary. So now if you really want to take the most cynical approach to this or interpretation, and again, this is just one interpretation, they took an open source project, they closed it, they raised money, and then within the next 2 years on this incredible innovation, they sold $2 billion and put that in their pockets. Now, those employees, if it was a for-profit, obviously no problem with that. But they took the stated mission of giving this to all of humanity and then took 3 or 4% of that gain and put it in their pockets. That's where I think this whole thing is going to get really crazy. And this is where the IRS... That's a good point. Yeah, and the IRS also interpreted Mozilla, which was just $100 million, and none of the employees took any of it. The $100 million that came out of Mozilla, they were just saying, I think you should pay tax on that. Should you pay tax on that? And then they were investigated for years. So I think the IRS is going to be on this like crazy based upon what happened to Mozilla, which was...
Jason, do you think individual employee sellers are going to get audited by the IRS because of this?
We're in uncharted territory here. When I did some tweets and said, hey, can everybody contact me who has information on these structures? I was able to find the Samasource example, and they did it very clean. And there was no IP transfer or employees enriching themselves or, a God King like Sam doing all kinds of deals and enriching himself. it was a very clean structure. And then Mitchell Baker, who set up Mozilla, also did the same thing. Hey, we'll just pay the employees an extra $50K on their salaries, and they'll be a little overpaid in Silicon Valley, but they're not getting billions of dollars in equity, which again, I have no problem with people getting billions of dollars in equity in a for-profit. But this was supposed to benefit humanity. It was supposed to be open. If this was open source and they took the $2 billion, I would actually not have much of a problem with it, because we could all be looking at that mission, and then Sachs and myself and Friedberg and anybody who wanted to use that code could go in there and adapt it. And you know what? There are for-profits, Apple and Meta, which are producing open source software. So if they're producing, Apple's pretty competent and Meta's super competent in this respect. They're able to do open source. But Sam is claiming, or OpenAI is claiming, it's too dangerous to show us the open source code. I call bullshit on that. Their code is not too dangerous for us to see. That's complete, utter bullshit.
So you think that there was a motivation for profit, basically. What you're saying is essentially that this was highly motivated by profit. Versus like some of the emails try to paint a picture of very industrious people on both sides who are trying to solve a very hard problem and dealing with a conundrum that's really around capital, right?
Yeah.
We need to do all this training. It's going to be so expensive. But I think what you're saying, which is a deviation from that, is actually, come on, guys, these are all very smart people, and those folks saw an opportunity to make a ton of money, and they took it.
I mean, that seems like what happened here to me. I mean, it's Occam's razor kind of situation. I think if you look at it, I think they probably regretted making this a nonprofit and then tried to figure out a way to reverse it. That's actually what I think is going on here. And I do think there was part of it, Chamath, you're right, that they needed servers and they needed capacity. But they could have done that without giving the employees tons of equity, without selling billions of dollars, keeping it open source, and then telling Microsoft, hey, if you want access to this open source or whatever, and they could give
you're making a very, very good point. And the reason is that if it was open source, Microsoft could have just taken it and done its own training and just paid for it.
Yeah.
Right?
Or make a donation to the foundation.
This is interesting because
it's a very good point, Jake.
Because OpenAI dropped a few of the emails that they had with Elon. Obviously, those are cherry picked to help their case the most. What we don't know is what do the other emails show? Like, what were their alternatives to this particular structure? Could they have raised the necessary funds in a way that was more consistent with the original mission of the company? Could they have remained open source, for example? Also, are there any emails where employees talk about the potential benefit to them of going for profit, right?
Those emails have already been leaked. There was this thing where in the OpenAI emails that were leaked, they talked about being able to swap this phantom equity in OpenAI into either YC equity. And then Elon said, oh, maybe SpaceX too, but I'll have to figure that out.
Well, then also like Microsoft coming in and buying 49%. And then it's close. This is the other piece that I would want to see in Discovery as well. And again, I don't have any problem with any of the people. I love Sam Altman. I think he's great. I think all the people there are great. I think what they've done for humanity is great. I just think they should have kept this thing open source, which was the mission. But then they close source it, Chamath, and then give 49% of it, all the weights, all the source code to Microsoft. So that to me was like a really, like, you want to talk about taking this nonprofit's IP and then some amount of that bag gets given to the employees for billions of dollars. And then Microsoft gets 49% of all that nonprofit's effort to then go commercialize. And Microsoft has added, $500 billion in market cap since this whole thing has been announced. So now all that profit has been aggregated into Microsoft stock.
And I think this is where you got to understand why Elon feels swindled, is because not only are we going from nonprofit to for-profit and open source to closed source, he was specifically concerned about all of the benefits of AI accruing to one powerful big tech company. Now, at that time, he thought it was Google. Now it's Microsoft. There's not really that much of a difference. He never wanted all the benefits of AI in the hands of one really powerful tech company.
Right.
And Microsoft is it's now the biggest company in the world by market cap. So this is like the opposite of what he intended.
They gifted $1 trillion to Microsoft, probably. There's an easy solution. If they are people of good faith and they're doing this for the right reasons, open source it. Just go back and open source it.
Jason, but to your earlier point, that may solve the lawsuit and Elon may drop the lawsuit, but it's opened a can of worms with respect to tax and structuring that's much bigger than just OpenAI.
Yeah, I
It's
don't
the
think it
entire
solves that,
nonprofit
but-
industry. It's a tax problem for every new company. It's every other entrepreneur that studies this model and tries to replicate it for their own personal gain, even if that wasn't intentional here.
Yeah.
So there's a whole set of issues that we've really cracked the egg here. We gotta figure out how to unscramble it.
There's the IRS issues. Then there's what's morally right, and then there's Elon's beef. And if it is a for-profit company, and Elon put in $50 million when it was a seed round, what would he own, Sachs? What would his ownership in this for-profit be?
Oh my God. I mean, probably
98%.
Okay, and so
Yeah, we need to know the total size of that round. He put in the first 40 million. Do we know what other people put in? It was most of the money, right?
yeah, it was most of the money. So I mean, if you let's just put a crazy valuation on it, $500 million. Okay, he owns whatever, 10%.
No, that's
because
not
at
gonna be enough.
that point, it would AI was not what it is today.
Of
So
course
you would
not.
have raised that you would have raised 150 on 50 pre.
Okay.
I mean, that's the way that a very
Right.
capex intensive deal in a space that wasn't thought to yield big outcomes. That's unfortunately
Elon
the
would
cost
own
of
half the
capital.
company at least.
At
All
least.
right, so give him 20% of the company. It's $20 billion. That's even half of what you're saying, Zach, right?
We talked about on the show when that whole fracas with these nonprofit directors went down, is we said, go back and restructure the whole thing to make it what it always should have been, which is just a clean for-profit entity. Give Elon his equity. Give Sam his equity. Because it never made sense that
that's
Sam
another
didn't have
weird thing.
equity
Sam
either.
has no equity, but he's got a venture firm. It's all so convoluted.
It's a weird form of compensation in which they're giving him corporate opportunities in effect as like a type of compensation, when
Yeah.
really he should just have compensation in the corporation, and then the corporation should own all of its opportunities.
Oh, that's okay. That's a really interesting thing you just said. So basically, yeah, it's like he famously has no equity, but then he has this retained optionality to monetize the ecosystem. So even though he's not
Yeah.
monetizing the thing, he gets to monetize everything around it.
And it seems like the board, or at least the new board's okay with that, because he is being undercompensated with respect to the main thing. So then he gets the side things, but that's not really the way it should work either.
You know, Bill Gates said to us famously when I was at Facebook, the value of an ecosystem is when the economic value generated by the ecosystem exceeds that of the platform. Now, in this case, you'd actually rather have 50 basis points of the ecosystem than 5% of OpenAI, if that's true. Because if this thing could be so revolutionary, you're talking 10, 20, 30 trillion dollars.
What a mess. Oy, oy, oy.
Sam should just be given like a huge option grant in OpenAI, but then OpenAI should own its own venture fund.
Yeah. And the SEC is looking into all this stuff. They look into a lot of things in fairness, but they're looking into it. What a mess. And we'll keep track of it. The other thing that's crazy, I don't know if you guys know this, but Nick, just as we close here, the most insane part of OpenAI's LP investment agreement, which is on their website, you can just search for OpenAI LP agreement, is this part. The partnership exists to advance OpenAI Inc.'s mission of ensuring that safe artificial general intelligence is deployed and benefits all of humanity. The general partner's duty to this mission and principles advanced in OpenAI's Inc. charter, yada, 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 take precedent over the obligation to generate a profit. The partnership may never make a profit, and the general partner is under no obligation to do so. The general partner is free to reinvest any and all of the operating entities' cash flow into research and development activities and or related expenses without any obligation to the limited partners. And so they basically told everybody, Vinod and employees or whatever, we can just basically wipe your equity out and we can do whatever we want with the profits. And you're probably going to lose your money. So this structure is weird.
Do you guys think that when the investors came in, especially in this latest round, the $86 billion round, do you think they underwrote the legal risk inherent in the structure, or they just sort of hand waved over it and said,
No. Typically what happens in these deals is you hire somebody like KPMG or Deloitte or Ernst & Young to do like the full financial diligence packet, right? And that typically tends to be how a lot of late stage organizations document that they've done and manage their fiduciary responsibilities on behalf of their limited partners. So what happens is you will do a deal, you'll sign a term sheet, you'll turn it over to Deloitte, you'll turn it over to KPMG and say, please go and run this down. And then what they do is they will furnish a report that says, yes, this meets all the customary expectations. I suspect that if these folks were doing a decent job of running late stage money, They probably sent it to those folks, and those folks probably produced something that said, this looks fine. Now, if you read Buffett's letter this year, he has a really great commentary on Deloitte and KPMG and these sorts of letters, which is not exactly the most supportive, is the best way to say it. Nick, you can find that mention. In his case, it's Deloitte and Touche. But typically, Sachs, that's what they do. They go to a KPMG or a Deloitte or a Ernst & Young and say, and by the way, 99% of the time, they do really good work, but it's a standard structure. And they just want to make sure that nothing nefarious is amuck. In this case, I doubt anything was amuck anyways. I doubt, though, that they looked at the structure and then also elevated the litigation risk of this getting unwound. I just don't see that diligence report, and I've seen enough of them, typically has that section in it.